We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, today we're going to speak about disproportionately the Warner Brothers acquisition, needless to say. I could begin this by talking about the political differences that have been alleged in the two buyers and the seller. I could, of course, continue to talk about the last administration that never found a merger that they could accept and blocked many, even when overthrown repeatedly by the courts. I could, but I won't, because in fact, this is an antitrust hearing, and I'd like to focus on that. And I admonish all of our witnesses in their answers to get off the politics and get on to the specifics of antitrust law. So I'm going to start with Professor Jung. You mentioned the Philadelphia case, but you had some doubts, even though Nielsen has said that in the streaming, you have a 37% market share already by Netflix, an additional 6% to be acquired. Is there any reason that we shouldn't believe that that is at least in the ballpark of correct, based on one of the largest and most historically significant rating organizations?
Thank you, Representative Issa. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this. Yeah, I think you're hitting on the key issue, which is the reliability of the data that we're using for this presumption. And this presumption is very important. Again, we can debate whether it should be, but it is standing law today.
Right, but it's standing law to push the scale to where there's essentially no further choice and you more or less close the door. Even if, in fact, hypothetically, they're at 29%, and let's just say that Warner Brothers is 5%, you're still going over the 30%, and few would doubt that you're going to end up with that. Let me get into a couple of points that you hit. Since 2011, Netflix has increased price 10 times and a total of 39% increase after adjusting for inflation. Is that per se a demonstration of market power by any reasonable definition?
So I can get into the weeds. I would say that almost every streaming service has some degree of what we in economics call market power. It's not the same as what we think in antitrust. And so what do I mean by that? So earlier there was a chart that was shown.
Well, but let me back you up because I have limited time. The reality is that the price and the cost of receiving a streaming service on an adjusted basis led by Netflix has gone up but not down. So from a standpoint of a market that is functional, that we would normally think lowers cost as volume goes up, would you say that this market shows signs of not being functional based on Netflix's consistent lead above the rate of inflation?
The reason why I have some concern about the premise that this is necessarily a problematic market is simply because I saw a chart that showed the highest price increases were from Apple Plus, Peacock, and Paramount Plus, who have the lowest share in these markets, and the lowest price.
And aren't they all still losing money?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so isn't there a difference between when you're making money and you increase prices beyond inflation, and when you're losing money and you try to minimize your losses?
I think that's fair.
Okay, I want to go on quickly. You talked about vertical and horizontal, and there's plenty of case law, including the Supreme Court case that broke up the relationship between the studios and the theaters being owned. Aren't we again in a situation where if Netflix, post-acquisition, controls a massive library to the exclusion of others, that in fact we have the same situation again in which, and I'll just use my own words, if you can exclude and you are a must-have and must-pay and must-buy, isn't that in fact a situation in which at a minimum everyone would have to have Netflix in order to have access to not just new production, but a vast library that, in fact, by definition, every child grows up watching?
I think it's a relevant concern. It's something they'll definitely look at, for sure. I did look at some statistics that showed what is the percentage of Warner Brothers in terms of theater production. And it's at about 15 to 20%, so roughly 80% is outside of that. So I think that...
And of course, theater production is important. I was talking about libraries, and they are both important. Let me just close with one closing question, which is, you've looked in the past at the years that this committee oversaw the potential mergers to create competition against Verizon by Sprint, AT&T, T-Mobile, ultimately making a decision that a relative duopoly was better than one strong player and many weak. Aren't we in many ways in that same situation, if you could opine on that?
I think it's going to depend on how we define the relevant market in terms of what is really constraining Netflix's price. But yeah, if it's fairly narrow, yeah, the consolidation is definitely going to be something that's sufficient for probably the presumption.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr.